Imagine a world teetering on the edge of chaos. Europe is tense, Asia is restless, and the shadows of war are growing longer every day. In the midst of this storm, one nation sits on the sidelines, watching, hesitant, uncertain. This is the story of the rise of the Axis powers, and how the United States struggled to decide whether to intervene or stay neutral. In 1933, a man named Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany. The country was reeling from the devastating effects of World War I and the humiliating terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which left Germany politically and economically crippled. Hitler and his Nazi party promised to restore Germany's pride, rebuild the economy, and expand the nation's territory. What many underestimated at the time was that his ambitions would not only engulf Europe in conflict, but would eventually draw the entire world into war. Meanwhile, in Italy, Benito Mussolini had been consolidating his power since the early 1920s. Italy, inspired by fascist ideology, pursued aggressive expansionist policies. Mussolini's forces invaded Ethiopia in 1935, shocking the world and exposing the weaknesses of the League of Nations, the international body designed to maintain peace. At the same time, Japan, driven by militaristic ambitions, invaded Manchuria in 1931, aiming to expand its empire across Asia. These three nations, Germany, Italy, and Japan, would eventually be collectively known as the Axis powers, and their aggressive actions set the stage for the deadliest conflict the world had ever seen. In the United States, the mood was drastically different. Having suffered through the Great Depression and recalling the heavy losses of World War I, the American public and political leaders were committed to a policy of isolationism. Congress passed the Neutrality Acts in the mid-1930s, legally restricting the United States from providing direct military support to nations at war. The principle of America First dominated the national discourse, reflecting widespread reluctance to entangle the country in foreign conflicts. Despite its official neutrality, the United States could not completely ignore the unfolding crisis. President Franklin D. Roosevelt recognized the growing threat posed by Axis expansion, particularly Germany's rapid militarization and Japan's aggressive campaigns in Asia. Roosevelt sought to balance public opinion and international responsibility by pushing the Lend-Lease Act, allowing the U.S. to provide weapons, supplies, and financial aid to allied nations like Britain and later the Soviet Union, without committing troops. This act marked the first significant step of American involvement, even while the country officially remained out of the fighting. Meanwhile, Hitler's Germany was not waiting for diplomacy. In 1938, the Anschluss incorporated Austria into Germany, followed by the Munich Agreement, which permitted Hitler to annex the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia under the guise of uniting German-speaking peoples. Each concession from the Allied powers, particularly Britain and France, emboldened Hitler further, revealing the dangers of appeasement. The stage was now set for a larger conflict. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, unleashing the fury of the Blitzkrieg, Lightning War. Tactics that combined rapid movement, tanks, and air power to overwhelm the enemy. This invasion forced Britain and France to declare war on Germany, officially marking the beginning of World War II. During these critical early years, the United States continued its cautious approach. Roosevelt delivered speeches warning Americans of the global threat, including his famous quarantine speech in 1937, which called for nations to isolate aggressive powers like Japan and Germany. Despite these warnings, isolationist sentiment was still strong. Many Americans believed that the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans would protect the country, that foreign conflicts were Europe's problems, and that military engagement was a last resort. In Asia, Japan's expansion continued unchecked. By 1937, Japan had invaded China, sparking the Second Sino-Japanese War. Reports of atrocities, such as the Nanking Massacre, horrified the international community. Yet, the U.S. maintained economic sanctions and diplomatic pressure rather than direct military involvement, illustrating the limitations of isolationism. As the war in Europe intensified, Germany quickly conquered Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France in 1940, shocking the world with the speed and efficiency of the Blitzkrieg. Britain, under Prime Minister Winston Churchill, stood alone against Nazi Germany after the fall of France. The Battle of Britain, an air campaign waged between the German Luftwaffe and the Royal Air Force, became a symbol of resistance, but Europe was clearly under threat. Despite the escalating global conflict, the United States continued to prepare rather than act. Roosevelt recognized that direct involvement might be necessary, but he also understood that the American public was deeply wary of another war. The U.S. military began secret preparations, expanding the army, training troops, and increasing production of war materials. Shipyards, factories, and aircraft plants were quietly gearing up, preparing the nation for a future that many still hoped could be avoided. And during this time, the Lend-Lease program became America's primary means of influencing the war without direct combat. Supplies of weapons, vehicles, and financial aid flowed to Britain, strengthening the Allies while keeping American soldiers out of harm's way. Roosevelt's careful navigation between neutrality and preparation would prove crucial in the years to come. And by the end of 1941, the world had changed dramatically. Axis powers controlled vast territories, and the threat to global freedom was unprecedented. Yet, the United States remained officially neutral, though increasingly involved behind the scenes. That would all change on a single day in December 1941, when the isolationist policy would be shattered forever. Rise of the Axis powers, combined with America's cautious approach, set the stage for the defining conflict of the 20th century. Chapter 1 closes here, leaving the world on the brink of full-scale war, and America standing at a crossroads, caught between the desire for peace and the looming necessity of intervention. America enters the war, 1941. Start. End December 7, 1941, a date that would live in infamy. While the world was already engulfed in chaos, one nation that had remained on the sidelines for years was about to be thrust into the heart of a global conflict. The attack was sudden, devastating, and unstoppable. This is the story of how the United States could no longer stay neutral and stepped into World War II. years, the United States had watched the war in Europe and Asia unfold with cautious concern. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had been warning Americans about the dangers posed by Hitler's Germany and Japan's militarism, yet the majority of the public remained deeply committed to isolationism. The memories of World War I still haunted the national psyche. Americans were determined to avoid foreign entanglements, and Congress had passed the Neutrality Acts to ensure the country stayed out of the fighting. These laws prohibited the sale of arms and war materials to nations at war and restricted American citizens from traveling on belligerent ships. Despite this official neutrality, the United States began to take steps behind the scenes. Roosevelt pushed the Lend-Lease Act of March 1941, allowing the U.S. to provide weapons, food, and financial aid to allied nations, primarily Britain and later the Soviet Union. This move was carefully framed as support for democracy, without direct military involvement, but it marked the beginning of America's growing commitment to the war effort. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the Pacific seemed calm, and few Americans anticipated the disaster that was about to unfold. Japanese forces launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In a carefully coordinated strike, hundreds of Japanese aircraft descended on the harbor, targeting battleships, destroyers, and airfields. Within 2 hours, over 400 American servicemen and women had lost their lives, and more than 1,000 were wounded. 8 battleships were damaged or sunk, and nearly 200 aircraft were destroyed. The American public, previously divided over involvement in the war, reacted with a surge of anger and resolve. Newspapers across the country ran the headlines, "Pearl Harbor attacked" and "America at war." President Roosevelt addressed Congress the following day with his famous speech. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The speech galvanized public opinion, and the declaration of war was passed almost unanimously. For the first time, the United States officially entered World War II. The impact of America's entry into the war was immediate and far-reaching. Germany and Italy, allied with Japan through the Tripartite Pact, responded by declaring war on the United States on December 11, 1941. With this, the war truly became global. Now the United States faced enemies in both the Pacific and European theaters, and the full-scale mobilization of the nation was unavoidable. The U.S. government quickly shifted the country's economy from peacetime production to war production. Factories that once made cars and consumer goods were converted to produce tanks, aircraft, ships, and ammunition. The nation's industrial output became a crucial weapon in the fight against the Axis powers. Shipyards, aircraft factories, and munitions plants ran around the clock, employing millions of Americans, including women who entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. symbolized by the iconic Rosie the Riveter. Meanwhile, the military draft expanded, bringing millions of men into the armed forces. Young Americans trained intensively in the U.S., preparing to fight in multiple theaters of war. The U.S. Navy began patrolling the Atlantic, escorting convoys and confronting German U-boats that threatened Allied supply lines. In the Pacific, the Navy and Marine Corps prepared for what would become some of the most brutal battles in history, from the Battle of Midway to the island-hopping campaigns against Japan. America's involvement also brought a strategic shift in the global war effort. The Allies, particularly Britain and the Soviet Union, welcomed American aid and military participation. The infusion of American industrial might and troops gave hope to nations that had been fighting alone against overwhelming odds. Programs like Lend-Lease were expanded, and American ships, planes, and supplies flowed to the front lines, strengthening the Allies' position even before U.S. soldiers were deployed overseas. Despite the rapid mobilization, the early months of America's involvement were challenging. Training troops, building equipment, and transporting forces across oceans required meticulous planning. The United States faced the daunting task of fighting a two-front war, confronting Japan across the vast Pacific and Germany in Europe. Yet, the resolve of the American people and military proved unshakable. National morale soared, fueled by patriotism, determination, and the unifying outrage over Pearl Harbor. In NBY, the end of 1941, the United States had transformed from a hesitant observer to a fully engaged participant in the war. The attack on Pearl Harbor had shattered isolationism and forced America to confront the global threat posed by the Axis powers. The stage was now set for a series of pivotal battles and operations in which the United States would play a decisive role, ultimately changing the course of history. In retrospect, the United States' entry into World War II marked a turning point not only for the war itself, but also for the nation. It catalyzed economic recovery from the Great Depression, united the country in purpose, and established the United States as a global military and industrial superpower. The shock of Pearl Harbor served as a stark reminder that neutrality was no longer an option, and that the fight for freedom, democracy, and human survival demanded full participation. As 1942 approached, the United States was no longer watching from the sidelines. It had committed its industry, military, and people to a war that would reshape the globe. The coming years would test the courage, ingenuity, and resilience of the nation, as American forces prepared to take the fight to distant shores, in both Europe and the Pacific. This chapter of history underscores the transformation of a nation from reluctant observer to active participant, setting the stage for the monumental battles and turning points that would define World War II. D-Day and the European Theater, 1944, June 6, 1944, the world held its breath. On the beaches of Normandy, the largest military operation in history was about to unfold. Thousands of soldiers, from America, Britain, and Canada, prepared to storm fortified beaches, facing enemy fire, mines, and the unknown. This was D-Day, the day that would change the course of World War II forever. NBY 1944. World War II had raged for nearly 5 years. Germany had occupied vast swaths of Europe, and the Allies were desperately seeking a way to liberate the continent. The Eastern Front was tied up with the Soviet Union pushing back the Germans, but the Western Front remained heavily fortified under Hitler's command. The Allies knew that a bold, decisive strike into Nazi-occupied France could turn the tide of the war, and that strike was to be Operation Overlord, commonly known as D-Day. Planning for D-Day began long before the soldiers set foot on the beaches. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, coordinated one of the largest military operations in history. Strategy required meticulous preparation, assembling a massive fleet of ships, training airborne troops, and devising methods to deceive the enemy about the actual landing location. The Operation Bodyguard Deception campaign successfully misled German forces into believing the invasion would occur at Calais, keeping Normandy defenses unprepared for the actual assault. On the morning of June 6, 1944, over 156,000 Allied troops landed on the beaches of Normandy across 5 key sectors: Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Thousands of paratroopers had already been dropped inland during the early hours to secure bridges and disrupt German reinforcements. Soldiers faced intense opposition. Machine gun fire, artillery shells, and strategically placed obstacles threatened to stop the invasion before it could even begin. The bravery and determination of these men would define the operation. NNTHE Omaha beach landing, largely involving American forces, proved to be one of the bloodiest. Troops waded through waist-deep water under relentless enemy fire, losing many comrades within minutes. Yet despite staggering casualties, the soldiers pushed forward, scaling cliffs, overcoming barbed wire, and establishing critical footholds on the beaches. The success of these landings was a testament to careful planning, courage, and sheer resilience. Meanwhile, on Utah Beach, American forces encountered lighter resistance and managed to advance inland more quickly. British and Canadian troops at Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches fought fiercely against German defenses, securing their objectives and paving the way for the liberation of France. Airborne troops and naval bombardments played critical roles, softening enemy defenses and providing cover for the infantry. The scale of D-Day was unprecedented. Thousands of ships, landing craft, and aircraft were involved, and the operation required seamless coordination between multiple allied nations. The risks were enormous, and the potential consequences of failure could have altered the entire war. Despite these dangers, the Allies pressed on, knowing that success meant opening a new front against Germany and giving the Soviets a better chance to advance from the east. And by the end of the day, the Allies had successfully established beachheads along Normandy's coast. Casualties were heavy. Over 4,000 Allied soldiers were killed, and thousands more wounded. However, the operation's success gave the Allies a critical foothold on the continent and marked the beginning of the liberation of Western Europe. The psychological impact on both sides was immense. Hitler had underestimated the Allies, strength and morale among German troops began to falter. The Pacific Theater and America's Victory, 1941 to 1945. NN, December 7, 1941, the day that changed America forever. While Europe was already engulfed in war, the Pacific erupted in flames as Japan launched a devastating surprise attack at Pearl Harbor. The United States, which had long remained neutral, was now thrust into a war spanning thousands of miles of ocean. This is the story of America's struggle, battles, and ultimate victory in the Pacific Theater. NNTHE, morning of December 7, 1941, began quietly in Hawaii. Sailors were going about their routines, unaware that hundreds of Japanese aircraft were approaching. In just 2 hours, the Japanese attack devastated the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Over 400 American lives were lost, battleships were sunk or damaged, and hundreds of aircraft destroyed. The nation was stunned, and the phrase, "a date which will live in infamy," echoed in the speech of President Franklin D. Roosevelt the next day. The United States had no choice but to declare war on Japan, immediately thrusting the country into the Pacific theater of World War II. NNTHE Pacific War posed unique challenges. The United States faced an enemy spread across thousands of islands, heavily fortified positions, and the vastness of the ocean. Early victories were critical to prevent Japan from consolidating its dominance. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 marked the first major turning point. American forces, using intelligence breakthroughs, anticipated Japanese movements and launched a counterattack. The result was a decisive victory. Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers, weakening its naval superiority and giving the United States momentum in the Pacific. Following Midway, the U.S. adopted the strategy of island hopping. Instead of attacking every Japanese-held island, American forces targeted strategically important islands, establishing airfields and naval bases. This allowed the U.S. to move closer to Japan's home islands, while bypassing heavily fortified positions that would have cost thousands of lives. Islands like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, and Iwo Jima became battlegrounds where soldiers, sailors, and Marines faced fierce Japanese resistance, brutal jungle conditions, and the relentless threat of kamikaze attacks. NNTHE human cost of the Pacific campaign was staggering. Soldiers faced not only the enemy but also disease, harsh terrain, and psychological stress. Yet, the courage and determination of the American forces never wavered. Stories of heroism, from flag raising at Iwo Jima to daring naval maneuvers in the Solomon Islands, became emblematic of the sacrifices required to achieve victory. NNBY 1945. American forces had advanced to Japan's doorstep. Despite heavy losses and growing desperation, Japan showed no signs of surrender. The Allies faced a grim reality. An invasion of the Japanese mainland would likely result in millions of casualties on both sides. Faced with this challenge, President Harry Truman and his advisors made the momentous decision to use a new and unprecedented weapon: the atomic bomb. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, leveling the city and killing over 140,000 people, including civilians. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, resulting in an estimated 70,000 deaths. The sheer devastation shocked the world and forced Japan to surrender. On August 15, 1945, Japan announced its surrender, and the formal signing occurred on September 2, 1945, officially ending World War II. The use of atomic bombs remains one of the most controversial decisions in military history. However, from a strategic perspective, it brought the war to a swift conclusion, potentially saving millions of lives that would have been lost in a prolonged invasion. It also signaled the beginning of a new era, the nuclear age, forever changing global politics and warfare. And America's victory in the Pacific was not just about battles and bombs. It represented innovation, determination, and the ability to adapt to unprecedented challenges. The nation had mobilized its industrial power, trained millions of soldiers, and coordinated massive naval and air campaigns across vast distances. The combined efforts of the U.S. Navy, Army, Marine Corps, and Allied forces demonstrated the effectiveness of strategy, intelligence, and perseverance. In the face of adversity,